This is the part 2 in our primer on foreign policy for U.S. Congressional Candidates series. Today, we're going to be focused on the so-called defense budget. The military budget might be a more apt name for it. My name is Ryan Black. I will be hosting. I am with RootsAction.org and ProgressiveHub. We have 3 excellent guests here today. David Swanson, Lindsay Koshgarian, and Khury Petersen-Smith. Thank you all for being here. We're going to start our conversation with David Swanson. David wrote the Foreign Policy Primer for U.S. Congressional Candidates. He is an organizing coordinator at RootsAction and executive director at World Beyond War. I guess to start, Bill, if you could post a link to the primer, that would be great so people have it. And then, David, to start, what is this Foreign Policy Primer and why was it written?
Well, thank you, Ryan, and everyone, and happy International Women's Day, a day that includes the history of Russian women demanding an end to the First World War, which perhaps hasn't yet ended. And by the way, the right to be forced against your will into a war through a draft is not a women's right to be desired. The reason for this thing, of course, is that Congress members almost entirely, with a few rare exceptions, are campaigning for some 40% of their job. They're seeking office. Candidates for Congress in the United States are seeking office to oversee spending, some 60% of which is for militarism, and they don't want to say one word about it. 96% of humanity, all countries on earth but one, don't exist in their platforms, on their website. There's no budget, there's no foreign policy, there's no treaties, no international law, no war, no peace. And we ask them why, and sometimes the reason, or in most cases, the excuse is probably the way to put it, is that they just don't know anything. Some of them actually claim that only senators are supposed to know anything, which actually is not true. And so we wanted to fill the gap and take away that excuse and provide something that might be of use to Congress members, candidates for Congress, and maybe everybody else too.
That's awesome. And I know it's already been a great resource for a lot of candidates who have reached back out to us and said, thank you for it. I guess the big question here, we're focusing on the so-called defense budget, the military budget, the Pentagon budget. Big question. I think we all generally know the answer to this, but candidates oftentimes act like they have no idea what's going on. So David, what's wrong with military spending right now? Regular people might ask, doesn't our military keep us safe? What's the big deal? What's the problem?
I'll try to give the short version of why it doesn't keep us safe. What's wrong with military spending? I could do 12 hours, so I'm not going to try that one. But, Pentagon officials will sometimes admit that foreign threats are hyped for financial and bureaucratic interests. Congress will routinely fund weapons that the Pentagon doesn't even want. So the motivation for the military spending is not generally defensive. Most of the weapons have no defensive purpose. It's also often counterproductive. Foreign threats are developed by hyping them and arming against them. Where the U.S. builds bases, it gets more wars, not fewer. Where NATO expands, we see more wars. Terrorism increased from 2001 to 2014, principally as a predictable result of a war on terrorism. Some 95% of all suicide terrorist attacks are conducted to encourage foreign occupiers to get out of somebody's country. According to the Washington Post, President Trump asked Secretary of so-called Defense Mattis why he should send troops to Afghanistan, and the reply was to prevent a bombing in Times Square, apparently oblivious to the fact that the guy who tried to blow up a bomb in Times Square had said he was trying to get U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. On March 11th, 2004, al-Qaeda bombs killed 191 people in Madrid, Spain, just before an election in which one party was campaigning against Spain's participation in a U.S.-led war on Iraq. The people of Spain voted the socialists into power, removed all Spanish troops from Iraq by May, and there were no more bombs in Spain. This history stands in strong contrast to that of Britain, the United States, and other nations that have responded to blowback with more war, generating more blowback. A December 2014 Gallup poll found in 65 nations the United States to be far and away the country considered the largest threat to peace in the world. A Pew poll of 30 countries in 2017 found majorities in most countries viewed the United States as a threat. It's become almost routine for U.S. military commanders, usually just after retiring, to argue that various wars or tactics are creating more new enemies than the number of enemies they're killing. The wars abroad are increasing hatred at home, the militarization of police. The wars are fought in the name of supporting those fighting in the wars, but the veterans are given little assistance in dealing with moral guilt, trauma, brain injury. Those trained in mass killing by the U.S. military are disproportionately those who become mass shooters. Militaries lose or have stolen huge numbers of guns that are used in violent crimes other than wars. And of course, the threat of nuclear apocalypse created by war and military spending is currently higher than it's ever been before, as well as the threat of climate apocalypse, greatly contributed to by militarism. So yeah, it doesn't make us safe.
Yeah, no, thank you for all that. I find the Spain example to be so good and so powerful. And I just wish more people knew about it, that as soon as they stopped bombing, then they stopped getting bombed. It makes too much sense. Another big question for you, David. Where's the money going? Where's all this money going? All this Pentagon money even going?
Well, I bet Lindsay and Khury will have some comments on this, and I bet we could go for hours on the bit of this that's known. There's some that's unknown, right? There's some unaccountability. The military is the one U.S. government department never successfully audited, and numerous secret agencies operate in secret. Even things that can be known are actively avoided by major media outlets. The National Endowment for Democracy apparently just deleted from its website some of the information on projects it's been funding in Ukraine to influence Ukraine against Russia. Setting aside the mandatory spending in the budget, including Social Security, Medicare, and other things that Congress doesn't address annually, as well as payments on debt, and looking only at discretionary spending, the money that Congress members spend each year at their discretion, over half in recent years has gone to military spending. Military spending, discretionary and otherwise, includes a budget of $750 billion for the Pentagon, plus hundreds of billions more for nuclear weapons in the Energy Department, military activities of other departments, including Homeland Security, the budgets of 17 secret agencies, debt for past wars, the Veteran Affairs budget. And this does not, I think, include things like the National Endowment for Democracy mentioned above, unless it's one of those 17. The U.S. military spending dwarfs the cost of most infrastructure and social needs spending legislation, dwarfs the cost of any other item or dozen items of discretionary spending, and dwarfs the military spending of any other nation. In 2020, U.S. military spending was more than that of the next 11 biggest spenders combined, 9 of which were U.S. weapons customers. The next 14 biggest spenders after those top 12, the only other ones to reach 1% of U.S. military spending, of those 14, 11 were U.S. weapons customers. Here's the percentage of U.S. military spending spent on the militaries of certain nations. China, 32%, Russia, 7%, Iran, 2%. In 2020, military spending per capita, the U.S. government was also at the top, and 21 of the next 22 were U.S. weapons customers. what could be done instead could be the subject of a whole webinar. 3% of U.S. military spending could end starvation on Earth. You can imagine the human and environmental good that could be done with a fraction of this money. Why would this not be the very first question for a candidate for Congress to have a position on, rather than something to be avoided like the plague? I obviously, this is a rhetorical question. Stay tuned for a future episode on the undue influence of the Mickey Matt industrial complex.
Right, and to clarify some of those numbers, what you said, like Iran is spending 2% of what the U.S. spends on their military. Russia spending less than 8%, and China spending 32%. The amount that Russia and Iran are hyped up in our media about being these massive, these huge dangers, and combined they don't spend 10% what we are, is eye-opening. And those are the kind of statistics that I think candidates need to understand about this huge discrepancy in the amount we spend. So thank you for that, David. David, last question for you. And I'm going to ask this to everyone because it's what's on everyone's mind right now. Very quickly, and I know Lindsay and Khury are going to touch on this. How does U.S. military spending play into the Ukraine crisis? This nukes, NATO, military bases, how does that play, and how are those two things connected?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. In that poll of some 65 countries, this was years ago, it changes year to year. In the United States, Iran was considered the greatest threat to peace on earth, despite that 2% of U.S. military spending. The expansion of NATO eastward under the Clinton administration and George W. Bush, more than anyone else, and Obama and Trump. The big driver, you read Andrew Coburn's latest book, is extensive on this. It's the weapons sales. Eastern Europe is needed as weapons customers. I mean, the power of this, is, I think, more significant than the politics, than the bureaucracy, than the fossil fuel interests, than the democracy versus dictatorship struggle, than anything else. I mean, the wars really are manufactured for the weapons more than the weapons for the wars. And you look at what's happened. You're getting new bases for the U.S. in Slovakia. You're getting billions of dollars of U.S. tanks into Poland. You're getting tens of billions of dollars of new U.S. weapons sold or given. Either way, it profits the weapons companies across Eastern Europe and into Ukraine, and weapons from Poland into Germany and then into Ukraine. There'll be more weapons to take their place in Poland. It's a business. It's making a killing off killing, and it is radically underplayed, if not completely left out of the story in the media.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. And I think we all know as activists where weapons usually end up over time. And it's usually not in the hands of the people we wanted them to. So thank you very much, David. Much appreciated. If you haven't checked out the primer, David wrote it. I strongly encourage you to read it. I just posted it in the chat. We also highly encourage you to share that with candidates that you like. We want candidates who overwhelmingly do not have foreign policy platforms, and certainly not strong ones. Send that to them. Help them build a foundation. Help them know what they're talking about a little bit, and give them some confidence to be strong on foreign policy, which is something that is lacking from most candidates. Next up, we are going to talk to Lindsay Koshgarian. Lindsay is the program director at the National Priorities Project, and her commentary on militarism and domestic/federal spending has appeared on NPR, BBC, CNN, The Nation, and lots more. We're going to talk to Lindsay about the current military budget and some ways we could cut military spending right now. Lindsay, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right, Ryan. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great having you here. Thanks for joining us. First question, you've been writing a lot about the current military budget and the proposals coming through. How did the latest military budget proposal balloon to where it is right now?
Yeah, so I'll go through a little bit of recent history to answer this, but I think, sort of underlining all of this, there's sort of the idea that this having a huge military budget is going to keep us safe, certainly in the event that there is a war, but also a big part of the rationale for it is that, if we have a big and bad enough military, we can scare bad guys from doing anything they shouldn't do. And we're seeing really clearly right now that that's not working. And it's certainly not working the way it was supposed to. But so I'll go back a little bit just because of where we are right now, kind of at the end of the Cold War, back in the 80s, there was a very high military budget under Ronald Reagan and, in opposition to the Soviet Union. But in the 90s, it came down significantly. It was still very high, but it came down a lot as what was supposed to be part of this peace dividend. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. We started 2 new wars, and it shot sky high again. And then what happened is that those wars peaked, in the late aughts, and the budget started to come back down again, but primarily because of this thing, the Budget Control Act, that limited federal spending for austerity reasons, because there were deficit hawks running Washington, and they wanted all the spending to come down. So military spending came down some. The problem was that domestic spending on social programs, on the safety net, came way down too. So what that did was it set up a situation where Republicans are for more military spending all the time. A lot of Democrats are too, but even the ones who aren't ended up getting in line for more military spending because it was the way they could negotiate for more domestic spending. So then what you see is through the teens, military spending rising again, partly because of this argument that we were going to get back into great power competition, which is an argument that we've been seeing for years. Certainly right now it's going to come to a head and is getting a lot of attention, but that argument is not new. That argument's been with us for a long time. So there was that rationale, but it was also politically just because these were the deals that were being cut. We're going to get more domestic spending and we're going to give up more military spending to get it. And that's a real problem that, even folks who would be with us in Washington are often not with us for that reason. So that's how we kind of ended up at the huge military budget we had a couple of years ago. Under Trump, the last Trump budget was $740 billion for a military budget. But now we've gone way beyond that. Over the last 20 years, we've spent $21 trillion on domestic and foreign militarization. 16 trillion of that was for the Pentagon and military, nukes, those things. And just for a comparison point, we could have had a fully renewable electric grid for the entire country for less than a quarter of that cost. So it's incredible, the lost opportunities that we've had because we put this spending in the places that we have. Now, long-term, there's this US pattern where military spending comes down, we have a war, it shoots way up, we end the war and it comes back down, but it never comes all the way back down. So what we have is this military budget that just creeps ever higher. But one constant through all of it is the contract spending. And, David talked some about the profit motive and the weapons contractors. For the last 20 years, contracts have been about half of the total military budget. That's half of the amount. Some years a little more, some years a little less, but on average, it's been more than half has gone to for-profit contractors. And that's the weapons contractors. I think that's what we all think of first. But it's also, it's also oil. It's also mundane things like laundry. It's also the private security contractors that we've seen in the global war on terror. And then it's also the 800 military installations around the world. And the troops, we keep 200,000 troops abroad at any given time on a permanent basis, including tens of thousands in Europe. So, the fact that we're doing all of those things and the fact that most recently those have been justified based on great power competition, which until very recently was primarily considered to be China, but now Russia's coming more to the forefront. Russia was always there, but it's much more at the forefront now, has brought us to this point where we had a $740 billion budget under Trump. Biden added to that in his first budget request. And then Congress added to that. And now we're seeing a situation where it's the fiscal year 2022 cycle that we're in is still having its budget finalized, but we're looking at it being probably around $800 billion. So that's a huge jump. And it's largely because of this rationale of great powers competition. So this is obviously really relevant to where we are right now.
Right, and plus didn't they vote for additional funding elsewhere or something? One thing that really struck me that you talked about, post 9/11 in the teens, Dems giving in on military spending to win things on the domestic front is interesting, because I think we learned that domestic spending can just get cut again the next year, but military spending just bakes itself in and it doesn't go anywhere. So I think that's really interesting that they made those deals. I wonder if they've learned anything. Right.
Yeah.
Be optimistic, right? Lindsay, the Afghanistan war just ended, and we mentioned that despite that, Biden still increased the budget, and then Congress just increased it more. How is that even possible? Like, really, talking to a layman who doesn't know anything, how is that even possible to end a war and increase the military budget? And I guess adding on to that, like, how much are we spending in the Middle East?
Yeah, it's extremely disappointing. Last year, kind of prior to the end of the war, the official war budget was around $60 or $70 billion a year. But of that, only about $20 billion was actually being spent in Afghanistan. The rest was just a slush fund for the Pentagon. It was, buying new weapons. It was replacing the things they were using in the war on terror. It was doing whatever they wanted. There's very little, as David pointed out, there's very little transparency. So it's, it ended up just being more money to their bottom line. So that's part of the reason why it didn't turn around into savings, because they weren't going to stop doing all of that other stuff. But the other reason is the thing I just mentioned about great power competition. They just immediately pivoted to, this is our new rationale. This is why we need more money now. This is a huge danger. And of course, we're seeing now that there is a real life huge danger from Russia, but this spending didn't prevent what is happening right now in Russia, and more spending wouldn't have prevented what is happening right now in Ukraine. And so that's the important point. I think part of it is that, we just need more political power for progressives. The Biden administration is fully bought into the great powers competition theme, and most of the folks in Congress are fully bought into that theme too.
Right. We need more progressives, like you just said, and we have a chance to. It's going to be maybe a rough midterm for Biden, but we need some of these progressives running on some of these foreign policy platforms. We need them talking about the military budget. What are some things that they could talk about right now? What are some things that we could cut from military spending right now?
Yeah, so the first thing right now is we should still be talking about cutting back on contracts. We should be talking about cutting back on the weapons contractors. They are seeing this as an absolute payday. Their stock prices are going through the roof. They're making all kinds of arguments. They're on the Hill lobbying about why we need to, send all of the weapons to Ukraine and then buy all of the weapons more to backfill that hole. So they just see this as a huge windfall. And we have to stop that. That's the first place to cut, is to say, no, we're not just a bottomless pit of money for more weapons. This has to stop. And part of it also is that, the Pentagon is going forward now with an $800 billion budget. There is no reason why they can't find the money. The current proposal for aid to Ukraine for Pentagon, for military aid is like in the $5 billion range. It keeps changing, so I'm hedging a little bit, but there's no reason they can't find that money in an $800 billion budget. This just doesn't make sense. So there's that. There's stop giving the contractors everything they want. There's stopping nuclear modernization. This is something that's been planned for years. And it's a really relevant issue right now. It'll cost something like $2 trillion over the next decades. And part of the package is making more of these tactical nuclear weapons. These are low yield and considered to be more usable nuclear weapons, but they are nuclear weapons. There's nothing usable about them. This is entirely the wrong signal for us to be sending right now to the world. We should be working towards denuclearization. This situation with Russia would be a lot less scary if we had less nuclear proliferation. And we need to work toward that going forward. So that's another place to cut. And the other thing is to close and downsize bases where we can. That's a tough call right now. It's especially tough right now to argue for downsizing in Europe. But we have bases everywhere. We have bases, we have bases in Africa. We have bases still all around the Middle East. We have bases in all over Asia. A lot of these are things that we don't need and or are actively making us less safe. So we need to talk about pulling back on a lot of those, because it does just feed conflict.
Yeah, and I think with the nuclear modernization, there was an admiral on TV yesterday, and he said, and I think he knows that people are talking about cutting things like ICBMs and postponing the modernization of the Minuteman III. He said, "Thank God we have ICBMs," which is just such an inside baseball thing to say on cable news. And I think he knew who he was talking to, but a gross thing to say when we're wasting so much money and will result in the end of humanity potentially. So yeah. Okay, I'm gonna one more question, Lindsay. We'll come back around to you during the Q&A on Ukraine, but we got to keep moving. I want to ask you last question. Today is International Women's Day. I did a poor job booking more women, and because there are a lot of events. Can you talk about how war and militarism are bad for women's rights?
Yeah, I mean, so I thought about this, and I think we all, it's pretty clear the way that war and militarism are bad for human beings. Period. And certainly there are ways that women can be more vulnerable to some of those things. But I actually want to talk more about the way that women can be the part of the solution to war and militarism. And that's that there are a lot of, civil society is full of women's organizations and women organizing for peace around the world. And often their involvement is one of the key ingredients to negotiated settlements for conflict, to rebuilding back after conflict. And so I think on International Women's Day, the important thing for us to do is to be supporting those groups and investing in those groups so that they can prevent conflict, so that they can do peace building, so that they can build back from conflict, all of those things.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Stick around for the Q&A. We're going to move on now to Khury. If you have not had a chance yet to open up the foreign policy primer, I posted it in the chat a bunch. I just posted it there again. Please check that out. Send it to candidates that you like. Send it to progressives in your area. Send it to people that you plan on voting for. Send it to people who you wouldn't vote for unless they added some foreign policy platforms. We want to get that out everywhere as much as possible. Our next guest, Khury Petersen-Smith. Khury is the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. He researches U.S. empire, borders, and migration. We'll talk to Khury about U.S. military spending, occupation of Palestine, and how our wars abroad connect to serious issues domestically. Khury, how are you doing?
I'm really grateful to be here, Ryan. So thank you. Thank you to RootsAction. Thank you to my co-panelists. I'm just excited to have this conversation.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to start with, I saw you had done some work with some solidarity movement with the people of Palestine. And I wanted to start there. What about Israel and the occupation of Palestine? What's that all? Does our bunch of our military money, or is our tax dollars going there and doing anything?
Yeah, it's doing a lot of really bad things. Let me get at that by just if I could say a word, and we've spoken throughout the conversation so far about what's happening in Ukraine right now. There's so much to say, but one thing is that I think that this is a moment of revelation for a lot of people around the world, and certainly in this country, about things that we don't talk about nearly enough, like displacement of refugees, like militarization, like invasions that are illegal, and occupations and annexation of land and things like that. So the kind of on one hand the problem that we're dealing with that David and Lindsay spoke to so thoroughly, which is a real deep commitment to militarism, not just to this or that particular war, but to militarism in general in Washington. It's going to require such disruption, and that's the bad news. But the hopeful news is I'm hopeful that this moment is a moment of revelation, that maybe people in this country looking at what Russia is doing will not only see this sort of aggressive power that's foreign, but maybe see a bit of a mirror and reflect on things that this country does that are rendered invisible. I guess that's what it's about. It's like there's something about this invasion that is making visible to many people militarism, displacement, and things like that. So one of those things that is just sort of taken for granted, that's just part of the landscape in Washington and in kind of US foreign policy, is support for Israel, which is extensive support. The US gives military aid to lots of countries around the world, but Israel in particular has gotten a special kind of amount and special treatment, when it comes to military aid over the years. The question you asked about US tax money, I'll just talk about the current situation, because again, US support for Israel and for Israeli militarism goes back decades. But to talk about where we're at now, in 2016, the Obama administration created with Israel this memorandum of understanding, whereby the US would commit $38 billion to Israel over a decade, meaning $3.8 billion a year, every year for 10 years, as a memo of understanding. This isn't going to be discussed every year. We already know for the next decade, 3.8 billion. But if that's not remarkable enough, that's just the baseline. Israel can actually pursue more money, which is actually what happened last year. And so, Israel got their $3.8 billion in US weapons, US fighter jets, US attack helicopters, jet fuel, that kind of thing. And then because Israel launched a horrific set of military operations in Gaza last May that folks will remember, and fired a lot of rockets from a weapon system called Iron Dome, which is also actually a joint project of American and Israeli weapons manufacturers. Because they fired so many rockets in this operation, they went to the US and said, you know what, we request an additional $1 billion. And the US granted them that. So over and above the 3.8 billion, Israel got another $1 billion. So that's the kind of spending, in terms of the tax money. And what is it actually going to? I mean, there's a number of things that when we talk about why the US supports Israel and the role that Israel plays in the Middle East, I think that there's a lot of things we could say, but of course, the people who pay the price in a very daily way are Palestinian people who, when the state of Israel was founded in 1948, hundreds of thousands were displaced. Those people and their offspring continue to be displaced. And then people who remain, Palestinians who remain within Israel's borders, are, to say second-class citizens really doesn't actually describe adequately. Even those Palestinians who have formal Israeli citizenship are, they're treated as a problem to be dealt with, to be removed, essentially. And that's what's happening in cities across the country. Certainly in Jerusalem, there's been a massive uptick in the forced displacement of Palestinians, which was actually the origin of what exploded last May. It was a conflict over displacement of Palestinians around Ramadan. So that's what the U.S. is funding. It's worth just the last word on this is, and this gets to, I think, why the U.S. is so committed to Israel. It is part of Israel, along with other US allies in the Middle East, and in particular, I'll say Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, are really coming together for a new kind of configuration, a new alliance in terms of promoting certain interests that are very much in line with what the US has wanted in the Middle East and wants today. And they frame it in terms of countering Iran. But the question of US support for Israel and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I think we have to talk about that whole configuration. We're talking about what the US is funding and where Israel fits in with that. People may remember that in the kind of last weeks of the Trump administration, they negotiated what were called these normalization agreements, in which states like the United Arab Emirates agreed to normalize relations with Israel. That resulted in another weapons deal from the United States. So this is about really promoting a certain set of interests or a kind of strategy for the US and its allies in the Middle East, which is why the US is so committed to Israel. And again, on a daily basis, it's Palestinians who pay the price for that.
Right, and I imagine that same commitment is there for NATO. And so for the second question, like I asked David, how is US militarism, US military spending playing into that Ukraine crisis? How do you see that?
It's such an important question. And before getting into the spending that's happening now, which Lindsay just spoke to, and the spending that I'm concerned about for the future, but which we're already seeing, not only the US, but NATO, that the whole alliance committing to a new round of militarization, with, of course, the United States leading the way. But before talking about the kind of present and the future, I just wanted to say another word about the past, because again, when we talk about the things that are those things that are made visible and those things that are rendered invisible, I think it's an important framework for looking at this crisis, because the way the media are covering it, it's just in terms of a Russian invasion of Ukraine in the present. And that invasion is horrendous. There is no justification for it. There's no defense of it. However, there is a context in which it comes. And we have to talk about the role that NATO has played in militarizing Europe for decades. I mean, since the early days of the Cold War, but well after the Cold War, 3 decades after the Cold War, and quite recently. And so I'll just say that actually under the Obama administration in 2014, there was something called the European Reassurance Initiative, which was an initiative whereby the US was able to sell weapons and fund the militarization of NATO and of Ukraine. And that initiative, again, started under Obama in 2014. In 2017, Trump actually put more money into that initiative and funded it further and changed the name to the European Deterrence Initiative. Now, I think that's important for a number of reasons. One is, again, there's no defense of this invasion, but the context is NATO has been militarizing Europe and Eastern Europe in particular for the years leading up to this. So that's part of the context. It's also worth noting the argument that officials have made and continue to make in Washington, which is that military spending and militarization in Eastern Europe acts as a deterrent for Russian aggression, is clearly false, because they invested billions of dollars in the years immediately before this invasion, and they did not deter the invasion. So that's, that doesn't hold up. I just think that's the other thing, sorry, just to say, is that it's interesting to think about, if folks remember the kind of relationship that Trump cultivated with Putin, and the way that that it was discussed in the US, which was that these guys are friends, they're in cahoots. And I think it's complicated, because I do think that on one hand, Trump had an approach to Putin that was like, we can make a deal with this guy. And, there's a sort of rhetorical and public warmth to Putin. But look at the actual policy, which is under Obama, we're going to do exactly what Russia doesn't want, which is militarize Eastern Europe. And then Trump actually escalates that. It's the continuity that Lindsay was talking about. It's like whatever is going on, regardless of who's in the White House at the moment, the fact that you have Trump makes a certain military budget, Biden raises it, Congress raises it further. Like the commitment is to more and more militarism, and that's consistent, even if there's a kind of rhetorical difference, which there was, between Biden and Trump, certainly in terms of as it pertains to Putin and Russia.
Right. Yeah. No, it's so interesting how the conversation was Trump and Putin being such good buddies, but then the policies just didn't play that out at all. I also think, Justin, how you're talking about this, progressives, it's so hard to make clear when we're talking about this that context does not equal excuse. There's to understand why things are happening or to have more information is never a bad thing. And so we shouldn't have to apologize or like be so defensive about it. But I totally understand why it's like that now. It's difficult to talk about. One thing I saw, Khury, that you had wrote about, and I'm trying to remember when, I don't have the link in front of me, but it was really interesting. And I was wondering if you could talk about it here, which is, how are U.S. wars abroad intimately tied to domestic issues at home, like police brutality? How are these things connected? These wars and all this money we're spending abroad directly hurting us at home in more ways than just we don't have healthcare, which is obviously like a big one.
Right. Yeah. So that's like, right. There's a kind of straightforward thing, which is the unreal kind of financial commitment that we're talking about could we obviously be used for so many other things. And Lindsay spoke to some, but there's just countless ones, right? But I think additional to that, it really does get at the commitment to what the U.S. does abroad is actually, which is a commitment to militarism. It actually is a commitment to the militarization of this place as well. Like, you know what I mean? Like it means not only is the U.S. economy militarized in this enormous way, the economy is there's so much of it goes to manufacturing weapons and so on. But you think about things like policing, and I think that, it's incredibly important. It's way overdue, the kind of conversation that we've been able to have over the past few years, driven by Black Lives Matter, about policing, about its roots and so on, historically, going back to the days of slavery, et cetera. But that conversation is incomplete if we're not talking about the US in the world. And so just as one of many examples, there's an extensive level of cooperation between local law enforcement in the US and state and federal, actually, and Israel, the Israeli security state. There's extensive training of law enforcement, American law enforcement with Israeli forces. Here in Boston, where I live, it's not just the Boston police, it's multiple campus police departments, it's the transit police, it's the TSA, who work at the airport, they train in Israel. So it's really extensive. So that's just one part. It's a kind of commitment to what kind of world do we want? And I think that at the moment, U.S. policy and policymakers are committed to, a heavily policed domestic society here, and see alignment with allies like Israel and say, oh, you also have an extensive police operation. Why don't we collaborate? That's one linkage, but really there are so many. I mean, if we're talking about the links between domestic policing and the formal military itself, the kind of pipeline from military service into local police departments, I think we have to talk about that as well.
Yeah, super interesting and, not great. I remember where I live, Fort Wayne, Indiana, not like a huge progressive city with a lot of protest and activism going on. But I was really proud because during the initial, George Floyd uprising and support for him in those protests, Fort Wayne showed out, and we were on CNN as one of the cities that had like major protests. And the most surprising thing, beyond seeing my town in northern Indiana like show this support, which was awesome, seeing the cops show up in armored vehicles that I had no idea existed in my town, and these guns and this gear and running over fences. A guy where I live had his eye shot out. He lost an eye to a rubber bullet in Indiana. Like, this is crazy. This is not like these big cities or anything. Nothing was burning down, but the violence was insane. And just seeing him, the optics that they provided and wanted everyone to see was very militarized. And that's all stemming from the money we're spending and how it trickles down back to the cops, who then spend that money to buy tanks and all that stuff. So yeah, no, it's all really interesting when you start exploring that stuff. We are running behind. We've had some great conversations. I'm going to get right into the Q&A. David, Lindsay, Khury, if any of you have to leave at any point, feel free. I want to quickly plug, if you all could put your websites in the chat. I want to quickly plug everyone real quick. Nationalpriorities.org is where you can find more of Lindsay's work, as well as IPS, and that website is ips-dc.org for the Institute for Policy Studies. That's where you can find Khury's work and lots of other amazing people over at IPS. And David, you can find out World Beyond War and RootsAction as well. You can also learn about some of our campaigns and at our new daily news site, the RootsAction new daily news site, ProgressiveHub.net, where you can find the latest stories and immediately take action right while you're reading the story. And most importantly, I guess, right in this moment, nowarinUkraine.org is our Ukraine campaign page. We're constantly keeping it updated with content, phone script, email the White House, all sorts of things that you can get involved, and we're updating that constantly. So check out all that stuff. And now let's move into the Q&A. We have a ton of questions. We're probably not going to get through them all, but David, Lindsay, Khury, feel free to just go ahead and answer these if you feel like you're the person to answer it, or if you have some thoughts. Eleanor asks, how do we change the budget to support people's needs instead of the military? Security and safety are found in food security, housing, education, medical care, not guns. So what do we actually do as activists? One thing I would say right away is get more progressives elected to office, send this foreign policy primer to them so they can actually lead with some actual strong foreign policy. That's what we need more than anything, is people willing to stand up to the military industrial complex and stand up to these forever wars. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, there's definitely something to members of Congress who might otherwise be amenable not having the tools or capacity that they need to talk about this. So I love that suggestion. And while I am officially fully nonpartisan, I can't speak to who should be elected. It does matter who's there. But it also matters what pressure they feel while they're there, right? So even if you don't have the perfect person in place, if they're feeling enough pressure, they're gonna be accountable. They want to get reelected. So so that's, voting is not our only tool, of course, in a democracy, and which is technically still what we have. So I think that's huge. Getting more people on board for this, and I think making connections between folks who are advocating for clean energy or advocating for healthcare or whatever, and showing them where the money is, I think is another big thing that we need to be doing.
I mostly agree. I think rather than a democracy, what we have is an oligarchy masquerading as a democratic republic that is highly corrupt, with a highly corrupt media and highly corrupt Congress members, and we need to provide them this information, if only to take away the excuse that they don't have it. But we need massive public pressure, as Lindsay said. We need nonviolent, direct action, and we need to change the conversation, including in the corporate media, if we can't create a substitute media that can take down the corporate media. And when it comes to anything useful, human needs, environmental needs, it's always, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? And virtually never does any congressional candidate or member or other media talking head give what is the most useful, most moral, and most popular and electorally beneficial answer, which is move it out of the military. You could watch U.S. television all day, every day for years and not know that militaries cost money. Nobody's telling you.
And that leads into the second question perfectly from Liz. What are your views concerning the role of the media in regard to the spending of the military? What's the media's role in how much money we're spending militarily? And anyone, feel free. Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just quickly say, I think, and this is not going to shock anybody listening, but you know, the media is a lot more pro-war than they have any need to be. And I think that's the biggest thing, is that they need to be a lot less credulous about war than they are.
Yeah, if I could say, I watched the State of the Union, last week or the week before, and I don't watch a ton of like TV, TV or TV news. So it was like jarring to see the kind of after, the recap on NBC, because the media analysts were far more militaristic than the president, far more, because they were kind of indignant about why isn't he for boots on the ground in Ukraine? Why isn't he for no fly zones? And I was really, I think that there's a lot to say about, not only how the media operate, but why they do what they do. And just one thing to say, I think that they are very, I think that there's structural reasons, and who owns who owns NBC and so on. But just in terms of the journalists themselves who are behind the desk that night, they're used to telling a certain kind of story, and they've been telling that story. There's a bully called Russia. There's an underdog called Ukraine. The United States is the hero. It steps in just like we did in World War II. It's the kind of the story. And the way the story goes, the US sends troops. And it was like they could not get why the president didn't get to that part of the story. I think it was quite a revelation.
I think in recent months and weeks, President Biden has been doing some press events where he just makes a statement and then he walks out without taking any questions. And I've been cheering. I've been like, yeah, goddamn right. And why the hell would I have that attitude? Why would I not want the president held accountable? It's because over the past year, you've seen, for example, press conferences after Biden and Putin meet. And Biden is remarkably respectful and de-escalating, and so is Putin. And then the U.S. media, the representatives of the U.S. media who get into both press conferences, there's nobody Russian in Biden's press conference. They're bloodthirsty maniacs. They want war. They're worse than the weapons dealers, the worst Congress members. They are the worst player in the whole mix. And you see in that State of the Union, the president finally admitting that his own son probably died from burn pits in a war that he led the creation of in the U.S. Senate. And he's pushing for more spending, as we've talked about on this call, and not a single word from any media outlet suggesting there's anything unusual about a guy pushing for more of what killed his son. It's just unquestionable for them.
Right. Great comment in the chat right now. Great for ratings, which is exactly what war is. So I dropped my son off. I have a baby boy, dropped him off at my mom's earlier this week to watch him for the morning. And she had The View on. And I have not watched cable news in a very, very long time. And like Khury was saying, shocking. The first thing I saw was Lindsey Graham calling for the assassination of Vladimir Putin. And then they cut to the news people and they're like, yeah, that's a normal, sane, fine thing to say. Let's continue on with the day. And I was like, what, Mom, are you watching this? This is insane. Yeah, terrifying. I strongly recommend not watching it. But it's also important to know what everyone else is hearing, and it's terrifying. We have lots of questions. What can we do, if anything, to prevent or combat these weapons manufacturers who are capitalizing and encouraging wars? Is there anything we can do to them? Or to prevent this? David looks like he has an answer.
I don't want to monopolize. I have endless answers. Yeah. I mean, we can do divestment campaigns. We're successfully taking money out of weapons companies. We can create bad press for them. We can disrupt their shareholder meetings. We can protest. We can put our bodies in front of the trains and the trucks. We can get laws passed to restrict weapons shipments from here to there. We can work with labor unions that are stopping weapons shipments. I mean, yes, there are endless things we can do. And there are big movements around divestment and other tactics related to nuclear weapons, which of course is the top priority here, as Lindsay already said, in terms of what to cut the nukes. This is where we start. And we can go after the weapons companies arming the worst, most oppressive governments from Israel on down. We can go after the U.S. government arming and funding almost all of the most oppressive governments on earth and stop obsessing over the few dictators that the U.S. government doesn't arm and fund.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Anybody else? Go. We'll just do one. Oh, go ahead, Khury.
Yeah, just let me something that's quite hopeful. When I think about this question of what can we do, I think about last August when the U.S. was doing its withdrawal from Afghanistan, and which was a total disaster. Not because the withdrawal shouldn't have happened. It should have happened. The invasion never should have happened. The withdrawal certainly should have happened a long time ago. But the way it was carried out, it was clear that actual Afghan folks were an afterthought at best. And once again, the media were prepared to tell a certain story of, here comes the Taliban, the bad guys, and the U.S. is going to help the innocents. And then it's like the record skipped, because that's not what happened. Instead of the U.S. being helpful, the U.S. essentially abandoned folks, was clear had no plan to evacuate people, and then kind of hastily, came up with a plan, carried out a drone attack during the week, killed more, innocent Afghan folks. And it was just such a disruptive moment, I think, for so many. After precious little conversation about what the U.S. has been doing in Afghanistan for 20 years, all of a sudden it was in the headlines, and a lot of Americans looked at that and said, "Oh my goodness, I thought we were helping these people, and it looks like actually, wow, what the U.S. is doing is pretty bad." And I think there's something really hopeful about that. Like it speaks to the notion that when people in this country are actually allowed to see what the U.S. is doing, when it breaks through, there's a kind of empathic response. So I think that ever since then, that story has not been covered so much, and I think that it's really incumbent on us to make sure to keep demanding justice for Afghan folks. And the U.S. occupied this country for 20 years, and you can't just leave after that and not talk about it again. The family of the people who were killed in that drone attack have yet to be compensated, as my understanding, even though the Pentagon said that they were working on it. That kind of thing we have to keep a conversation about. And I think it's really, this gets at, what we can do. I think we really have to ask the ways that our communities, our campuses, are entangled in this whole thing. I mean, Lindsay and I live in Massachusetts, which is a heavily militarized, so the whole country, but Massachusetts is like, the economy is so based on weapons manufacture. The northern suburbs of Boston are sustained with billions of dollars flowing through, from this military budget. We have to ask, how does that translate into our communities? Institutions like Harvard University, Tufts University, MIT have these fellowship programs where they train civilians and military folks who then go and administer the occupation of Afghanistan. All of the funding streams, the foundation money, all of that, I think we have to, wherever we are, ask how we are entangled, in this violence, and do what we can to demand something different.
You should see Virginia. Khury should see Virginia.
Yeah, Khury, you mentioned Afghanistan. I think it's important to point out that we arbitrarily split. What do we have? 6 billion, 6 trillion, 6 billion of their dollars, and we just gave them back half and kept half completely arbitrarily, which will contribute to the famine that is going to continue in Afghanistan right now, literally committing the United States to an ongoing effort to kill people. Shocking. Do one more question, then we'll get out of here because I know we're late. And this, I think, is kind of a tough one. If we get let's say progressives get everything we want and don't have NATO. Let's say there is no more NATO. We defund that part of our military to some way. How do we go about guaranteeing security against rogue actors, militias, nations? What is the pacifist security policy? Does anyone want to try to tackle that? If we were to no longer have NATO, if we were to defund the military in a big way, how do we have security from there? It may be an unfair question.
Well, one idea would be to stop being the world's weapons dealer. It's hard to find a war without U.S. weapons on both sides. You could create an incredible reverse arms race with the U.S. acting alone, combined with the U.S. ceasing to arm everyone else. You could take seriously the rule of law rather than talking about it. The U.S. is party to 5 of the 18 big human rights treaties, is the top enemy of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, where yesterday, yes, Russia didn't show up, but who showed up representing Ukraine? Harold Koh, who led the push to claim that attacking Libya would be legal, to argue that Russia attacking Ukraine was illegal. You could drop the hypocrisy and start supporting the rule of law. You could start supporting cooperative initiatives. You could democratize the United Nations, give up the veto, create democracy within the United Nations rather than using it as an armed group of thugs to attack people in the name of democracy. And you could develop the skills of nonviolent, non-cooperation. The people you see, or you probably don't see, in Ukraine who are stopping tanks with their bodies, changing street signs, putting up billboards, talking soldiers out of their neighborhoods. This is something that's been used in dozens of cases more successfully than violence. This is something the media is not telling us, that Ukrainians with no encouragement and no training and billions of dollars on the exact opposite training are still doing successfully and could be doing much more successfully. If you know how to not be occupied, you can't be occupied. And if you get rid of the weapons, there are risks in everything. But there's a guarantee that if we don't get rid of the nukes, our luck isn't going to hold out. So, where do you want to place your bets here?
I think that's right. And I think also harkening back to the Spain example, it's when we stop bombing people and putting weapons places, maybe the world will get a little more peaceful. Does anyone else want to add anything before we close for the night? Any final thoughts from anyone?
That example from Madrid is so important. And so I guess I want to speak to this question by making a plug for internationalism. Like when we think about a more peaceful world, it's actually not something that we can, this conversation can't just be a domestic US conversation. And that includes the demilitarization of this country, the demilitarization of our budget. Like it's not just that people around the world need folks in the US to, stand up and confront militarization. Those of us who live here actually need the people of the world we need to be in conversation and in relationship with them to be able to demilitarize. And I think it's about reimagining what relations across borders look like. And I'll just as one example, I think a bunch about what would it mean to completely recast the US relationship with Iran, which is at the moment is a horrendous, abusive relationship where the US has sanctions, has parked aircraft carriers off their coast, has done all these horrendous things to isolate and starve and brutalize Iranian people. It's very obvious that would have to go for a different kind of relationship. But I think about the fact that during the COVID epidemic, Iran was hit before the US, and they were hit hard. And US sanctions made that much worse, by the way. But imagine if instead of an adversarial relationship, there was a relationship such that medical personnel in Iran said, hey, we got hit with this virus. We were not prepared for it. We want to tell you about it. Imagine how, and the medical community in this country was receptive, was humble enough and international, you know, and had those links to actually have the conversation. I think it would have been an entirely different experience. Instead, we had to learn anew how COVID works and all this stuff. There's any number of things from pandemics to climate change that require cooperation, you know, across borders. And by the way, questions of how do we live in democratic, pluralistic societies, which we are certainly faced with here. We're not the only ones. People all around the world are asking these questions. So I really think that building those bridges is important, you know, for the present, but also for a different future.
Awesome. Thank you. I completely agree. And I think that goes back to a little bit what David was saying too about the reverse arms race too, and the need for internationalism and working together. Well, if that's it, David, did you want to have a close? Sorry, I saw your mic wasn't muted, but if we're good to go.
Lindsay's the one who hasn't said anything. I've spoken, I think.
Sorry. Lindsay, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I love what David and Khury said about, you know, how does a demilitarized world still keep us safe? You know, we need the rule of law. We have not really tried that yet. So that's, you know, we need to give it a shot, and it needs to be fully international, like Khury said. I'll just go back to the Ukraine thing, just as kind of the final example of this, is that, you know, sort of the way we think about it, the way we're hearing about it is, you know, the US, there was NATO expansion and the US has troops and nukes in Europe and all of these things, and it was a provocation, and nothing that Russia has done has been justified. But that's sort of that's the worst case scenario. But the best case scenario is actually that the US has troops and nukes in Russia, and that we, you know, have this huge military budget, and that's supposed to keep us safe, and it did nothing to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. That's the best case scenario here. So that's kind of what I want to add to that.
Yeah, no, hopeful, right? It's scary times right now, but we're here. And we have to keep fighting these wars and keep doing everything we can to make the world a more peaceful place. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, David. Thank you for writing the primer. Thank you, Lindsay and Khury, for joining us. If you didn't get your question answered, send us a message and we will try to get it answered. Everybody, thanks again and have a good night. Join us. We're going to be having more of these events. I know next month, I'm not sure exactly what the event will be on, but we'll definitely be talking about sanctions, U.S. public opinion, the War Powers Act, U.S. bases, foreign aid. We have a lot of things to talk about in this series. This is only the second event. Lots more to come. And I hope to see you all next time. Have a good night.